It's a question that has been on my mind for quite some time. Could the prince in the tower, Edward V, have saved himself? After all, despite the lack of a coronation, he was strictly speaking the king in the tower. Could he have deposed his uncle Richard as Lord Protector, or simply ordered his dismissal from the tower? Admittedly, this question is theoretical. Practically, the situation was clear. Power lay with the future Richard III, who had seized it by force and walked over corpses to defend it. William Lord Hastings, who was basically murdered, is an example of this. Richard's office and powers, however, derived from the king. At least 5 times Richard swore allegiance to Edward. Moreover, the idea of a minor king successfully positioning himself against his uncle, who is also Lord Protector, is not completely unrealistic and only dry theory. Edward VI opposed his uncle Edward Seymour of Somerset in 1549. The latter was Lord Protector and had dragged his nephew off to Windsor. Just like his unfortunate great-uncle, Edward VI was 12 years old at the time. However, he complained vigorously about his treatment. This was successful. Somerset had to let him go and was later beheaded for treason. The position of Lord Protector was not reassigned. Instead, the Privy Council conducted business and increasingly followed Edward's directions. As similar as the two situations may seem in this description, they are different. For this reason alone, Edward VI was, in quotation marks, lucky that the dramatic events surrounding the princes in the tower happened. The nobility reacted extremely sensitive to any attempt to isolate a king. Edward VI therefore had more room to maneuver than his great-uncle. This shows that the cases of minor kings should not be viewed in isolation. They are interrelated. Previous events serve as precedents for current events. The question of this video must therefore change and be formulated more generally. How much power does an English king have during his minority in the Middle Ages? When I started looking into this topic, I didn't have a YouTube channel. I had expected to be able to simply read a relevant study. Surprisingly, the topic has not yet been analyzed in a structured way. A number of excellent individual case studies exist. The closest to a reappraisal of the subject as a whole is the anthology edited in 2008 by Charles Beam, The Royal Minorities of Medieval and Early Modern England, which is, however, also a collection of individual studies but presented together. This is the table of contents, which also reveals which 3 essays I read before I recorded this. This is the curse of screenshots. But back to my work on this topic. My notes on the subject were getting longer and longer. This video should have been released weeks ago. But when my source notes alone reached 50 handwritten pages, it was clear that I had to take a different approach than for other videos. This here is a presentation of my own research findings and reflections, not just a rehashing of familiar topics that I enrich with my own research and thoughts. Therefore, I am not even sure that a video is the right format to approach this endeavor. Normal would be an essay, and ask if a scientific essay could be presented in video form in an entertaining way suitable for a wide audience. Many of my colleagues replied to me that only an idiot would attempt this. I was flattered to be named personally in this way, and here we are. This is, without question, the most difficult script I have written to date. However, for people interested in the medieval history of England and its kings, it is also the most rewarding and the one I had the most fun writing. I would therefore like to thank in advance all the people who have trusted me to go on this journey together. This is our route to work out an answer to the question on hand. The outline roughly follows the typical structure of an essay. The topic is introduced, contextualized, placed in the research context, and examined with the help of relevant sources. Here we go. First, an approach to England's minor kings. Second, the shortcomings of previous research. Third, the dialectical, paradoxical structure of the English system of rule. Fourth, the vagueness of the term minority. Fifth, the English system, strictly speaking, does not know minors when it comes to kings. Sixth, conclusion. I named the chapter slightly different in the inset, however they were easier for me to read that way, as I just did. That I speak constantly of kings may not be taken as disinterest in queens. England and Great Britain, however, had only one minor queen to rule, Jane Grey. As it is well known, she reigned for only 9 days, but I deal with her partly in the context of Edward VI. Jane, by the way, was also the last minor monarch to exist. I also omit the Anglo-Saxon kings. Although there were 5 minor monarchs, I do not have enough material available to make reliable statements about them. I therefore confine myself to the Norman minor kings. These are Henry III, Edward III, Richard II, Henry VI, Edward V, and Edward VI. Theoretically, Henry VIII could also be mentioned. The latter was still 70 years old when he inherited the crown. However, he immediately ruled in his own right. Nevertheless, we must come to him in chapter 4, since we owe to him one of the best sources for the age at which a minority should definitely end. Minor kings inherited the crown due to a system called primogeniture. This means that the firstborn child comes to the throne. England used the so-called veil line of primogeniture for a long time. This means the first boy becomes king. Henry VIII was the first monarch to depart from an absolute male line of primogeniture, having his 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, included in the succession in the Third Succession Act in 1543. His system is referred to as male preference primogeniture. The first king to appoint a woman as principal heir was Edward VI, but he replaced Mary with Jane, so this fact is often overlooked. That he would have a female succession without sons of his own was clear. Regardless, this developed a system of pure primogeniture, that is, inheritance independent of gender. For primogeniture, the right of substitution was and is traditionally recognized. This means that if the firstborn son dies without a child of his own or renounces the crown, the second-born son automatically succeeds him and is henceforth treated like the firstborn. The grandfather of the current king, Charles III, for example, became monarch in this way because Edward VIII abdicated voluntarily. With Richard II, this applies to one of our cases. Theoretically, this would also apply to Henry VIII, who, however, as mentioned, immediately ruled himself. The right of substitution and pure primogeniture combined made cases of minor rulers much less frequent. This touches on a point that has not yet been made explicitly. The minority of a king was and is an emergency situation. It is not intentional for a minor monarch to come to the throne. The system was not designed for that. Any minority was, therefore, an exceptional situation and was treated as such. Presumably, therefore, no coherent consideration exists. In fact, Great Britain has had a general procedure for the case of minority only since 1937. This is the so-called Regency Act. It was slightly modified in 1943 and 1953 respectively, but its essence was confirmed. It permits the appointment of a regent and creates the office of Councillor of State, who may rule in place of the monarch. Minority is already addressed in section 1. The law mentions 18 years as the moment of majority. 4 other points are worth noting, as they touch directly on the subject of this video and are clearly based on medieval experiences. First, paragraph 2 of section 1 of the Regency Act of 1937 looks like this. The moment of accession to the throne is set at 18 years for some activities, even if it factually took place before that. Second, the role of legal guardian for minor monarchs is clearly defined. In the first place, the corresponding function falls to the mother or the spouse. Thirdly, a further case can already be seen here that can also make a regency necessary. If a monarch is declared incapable of performing his duties, a regency also becomes possible. Thus, being a minor is now equated with being incapable of performing the functions of government. Fourth, the law sets clear limits on the regent's power. In particular, he is forbidden to interfere with the succession, a repetition of what Richard of York and the later Richard III did is to be ruled out in this way. None of the amendments to the Regency Act of 1943 are of interest to us, but one of the 1953 Act is full age is once again clearly defined as 18 years. Interestingly, none of the new laws directly answers our initial question. How much power does the minor sovereign have? It only states that the regent carries out the royal functions. There's still no provision for what happens if the minor monarch is dissatisfied with the regent. In some respects, therefore, our topic is still relevant to present-day England. The set regulations do not yet answer all questions. Responsible for this is the paradox of the British system of government, but let's first look what other scholars have to say to our topic, as little as it is. Historical scholarship was not completely blind for our topic. Aside from case studies for the minorities, the history of the coronation in particular has been the subject of research works. I fade the coronation out at this moment in this video because it deserves its own video. It is that important. In the process, historians have repeatedly elaborated the paradox of the English system of government with their own characterizations. David Starkey, for example, speaks of a royal republic. Charles K. Rowley and Ben View use the description a public choice model of autocracy. They even go so far as to speak of a public choice model of absolutism in medieval England. What such characterizations have in common is that they identify two essential forces that determine the political life of the country, a monarch and a public of some kind. Simplified, we may well speak of king and people, although historically the discussions about who actually belongs to the people and which rights are granted to which members of the population would have to be taken into account. It is in the nature of things that there can be a tension between these forces. Apart from the public choice model, however, there have been no comprehensive attempts to describe the evolution of the relationship between these forces. This assumes that monarchs rule for the people with the blessing of the people. Thus, a contract is concluded between the sovereign and his subjects. The people have their own representatives who set limits to the ruler's exercise of power. They are the guardians who ensure that the contract is followed. It is inevitable that an extreme situation such as a minor will have an impact on this system. The lack of comprehensive studies is therefore perplexing. It is possible, however, that a turning point is near. For example, Robert Bartlett at least devoted a few pages to the topic in Chapter 3 of his 2020 book Royal Blood, Dynastic Politics in Medieval Europe. It is little, but it is a start. Unlike the United States or France, England does not have a fixed constitution enshrined in a single document. Rather, the British Constitution is composed of key laws enacted over the centuries. It can therefore grow and develop dynamically. As a result, Great Britain has a much longer constitutional tradition than any other country. Magna Carta, dating from the 13th century, is generally perceived as the starting point. It stipulates that a monarch cannot impose new taxes without the consent of his nobility. But in fact, the Charter of Liberties would be a better starting point. It originated with King Henry I and restricts what the sovereign may do. Interestingly, however, this document also records by what legitimacy the king rules. He had been confirmed as monarch by the Pope from regard and love to God. The monarch is thus chosen by God. The phrase God's anointed king has become commonplace for this. There's also talk of a divine right of kings. We have countless examples of the corresponding self-image of kings. Richard the Lionheart, for example, chose the word God at my right in 1193 in the German city of Speyer, which is the motto of the British Crown to this day. Edward IV proclaimed laws to the honor of God. Whether the king was a minor or an adult made no difference. Chancellor Bishop Houghton, for example, said the following at the coronation of Richard II. Richard has been sent by God in the same way that God sent his only Son into the world for the redemption of his people. Well, good luck to anyone who has to start a job with this expectation and then is only 10 years old. The counterpart to divine kingship is consensual government. Its foundations are in fact already in the Magna Carta. Here, for example, paragraph 61 states that 25 barons may elect 4 of their peers who may demand that the king put a stop to grievances. Richard II got to know them in the form of the Lords Appellant. In 1297, other regulations are introduced that are based on consensus. For example, with Edward III, one of the most popular kings had to learn that the people are not willing to change the system. This source is an example for this. To this day, consensus is a key concept for the British system of government. The instrument of king's consent is an example of this. The king must give his consent when Parliament makes decisions that affect him and his rights in any way. For us, it should be noted, in the Middle Ages, the relationship between the monarch and the people, represented by Parliament, was dialectical in nature. The parties were, in principle, continually in conversation to negotiate their relationship. This was necessitated by the fact that their relationship was, in principle, paradoxical. The king was actually subject only to God, but nevertheless required the consent of his people's representatives. The latter were subordinate to the sovereign, but could nevertheless restrict him. Part of an act of Edward IV shows how this was practically resolved. By the advice and assent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal, as well as at the special request of the Commons at his first Parliament. Assent is included, but it is tempered by terms such as advice and request in the form that the king acts on his own authority and as a good monarch accounts for the wishes of the nobility and the people. Conversely, however, this also means that there can be a scenario in which the monarch wants to impose something that is not desired and for which he does not receive approval. There is no fixed solution for this, as it would always curtail the rights of one of the sides. In practice, this has often led to military confrontations. Theoretically, the question arises as to how the system could function at all if the two forces were constantly at odds with each other. Well, no one is better qualified than a German Protestant who lived at the turn of the 19th to the 20th century to help us with this problem. Max Weber. Weber was a lawyer, sociologist, and economist. He identified 3 forms of legitimate rule. First, legal rule, rule by law. Traditional rule second, rule by customary law. Third, charismatic rule. Charisma conferred authority and command. Rainer Lepsius later distinguished three situations of charismatic rule, which are also mentioned here because they serve well to see how it develops. Latent charismatic rule, the people desire a strong ruler to solve a crisis. Manifest charismatic rule, the charismatic person takes over the rule. Structure of charismatic rule, the rise of the charismatic causes a decline in institutionalization, as the charismatic does not need these institutions and may even perceive them as a hindrance. Weber is not very forthcoming on the extent to which the three variants can coexist simultaneously. We can, however, identify two of them relatively easily in England. Royalty embodies traditional rule. Parliament represents legal rule as its approval for laws becomes more important over time. The personality of the monarch determines whether charismatic rule is also present. This is important for us and the reason why we need Weber's model. It is the king as a person, not as an institution, who must bridge the gap between divine right and consensual government. Charismatic rulers can override parliament. If kings do not have this quality, the other side gains the upper hand. This shows why a minority is so problematic. It lacks the bridge or axis along which the sides can align. The king is needed to find a balance between the forces on which the country's system is based. England can therefore remove a king, but not the kingship. When the latter was attempted, Oliver Cromwell had to rise to become a substitute monarch. England thus needs both kingship and a king to function. A regency therefore automatically becomes a problem because a person exercises God-given divine authority to which it is not due. Without wanting to elaborate on this idea, since this video is about minor kings in the Middle Ages, this principle was not resolved until modern times. The sovereign as an institution is no longer opposed to parliament but has become the embodiment of consensus. He carries out what the people want and is thus the central integrational figure for the people, since he stands above the political day-to-day business. Well, at least this is how it is conceived in theory. In our time, we have a clear idea of when minority ends and adulthood begins. This includes kings, as shown, 18 years. In the Middle Ages, this age was also already a frequently mentioned point of reference, but did not possess any general binding force. The reason is that the kingship as an institution and the monarch as a person, although embodied in one and the same person, are not the same. Office and office holders are distinct. The kingship as an institution cannot be minor, but the monarch as a person can. Since office and office holder cannot be separated in reality, however, a blurring of what is actually a clear concept arises in the person of the king. A regency is, in principle, an attempt at separation. The office is provisionally held by a stranger until the office holder can do so. The divine right of the king poses a problem because it is linked to the person. It is the office holder who is anointed. He or she is chosen by God to embody the institution. It cannot be transferred temporarily. Transfer is possible only within the bloodline. Therefore, it is always pretended that a minor king is already of age. As an example, let us look at this document. I will also give you the simplified transcript. The document was addressed to Henry III and asked for military support for battles in France. The monarch was 8 years old at the time. He was therefore represented by a regent. This does not change with the passage of time and location. This paper is one page of a 13-page document from a German regional archive dated 1548. A recruiter is to recruit Landsknechts in northern Germany for the battles in Scotland. He complains that he is being hindered by the city of Brunswick. Edward VI was still represented by the Lord Protector at this time. Nevertheless, this does not appear in the letter Although it did not even go to England, the letter speaks about the royal majesty of England. I have highlighted this passage just like City of Brunswick. Whoever worked for the crown could be sure to act on behalf of the king despite the sovereign's minority. The fact that office and office holder had not yet come together did not matter. In practice, however, this led to all sorts of difficulties, such as a lack of royal authority because the regent was lacking God's consent. We see a variety of attempts to deal with this problem over time. For example, the sources avoid the word minor. This is an excerpt for the regulations for Richard II from 1377. I will also give you the transcript. The 10-year-old king is described as so innocent and tender in age that he needs a council to run the businesses for him. A regency by John of Gaunt was planned, but Parliament distrusted him and therefore decided on a council solution. We also encounter the word tender in connection with the regulations for Henry VI, who came to the throne when he was 9 months old. Here there's even the addition that he is so young that he cannot make decisions personally. We know of no corresponding descriptions from an official document for Edward V. His father's will would be a starting point for this. Only the version from 1475 has survived. However, there are no regulations for minors here as they were not considered necessary at the time. The first Norman minority happened at the wrong time. Henry III's father, John, had inflicted serious damage on royal authority and suffered major losses of territory in France. In 1219, the papal legate Pandulf wrote to Rome in alarm that the 12-year-old was called boy and not king. No real precautions had been taken for this minority. The regency almost inevitably fell to Justice William Marshall. He held an office that was closest to that of the king at the beginning of the 13th century. However, it was dissolved under Henry III. To ensure some sort of formalization, a council met for 2 weeks, which created the office of governor of the king and kingdom, which was transferred to Marshall. There was quickly a conflict with the Pope, who claimed the right to remove the governor. Marshall also found himself unable to ensure the king's safety. He delegated this task to a bishop. The holders of the highest offices wanted to keep them until the end of the minority. They used them primarily to enrich themselves, otherwise they didn't take the task particularly seriously. Especially Chancellor Richard de March was neglecting his office. Marshall, who died in 1219, also used his own seal as the kingdom once for the first 2 years. He helped his son to a political career as well. Hubert de Burgh gained great power as justice in the 1220s. Henry III could not and did not want to take over a truly independent government before 1234, although he had been actively involved in day-to-day operations since 1223. His influence could no longer be overlooked since 1226 at the latest. However, the minority never officially ended. The king declared in January 1227, after consultation with his council, that he would henceforth issue charters under his own seal. However, this did not mean the end of the minority. Until October 1st, 1228, he was generally still considered to be underage. Only after all of the king's representatives had left their offices and/or their lives, he was able to truly rule independently and end a long phase of instability. The next minority developed even more dramatically. This time it was Edward III. He was his mother Isabella's and Roger Mortimer's tool to dethrone Edward II. He was 14 years old when this happened. The Queen and her lover used force to be installed as regents. They displaced Henry of Lancaster, who was actually intended to be head of the government apparatus. Mortimer made himself Earl of March and married off his daughters to his extreme advantage. Edward was not only kept away from political decisions, but also suffered humiliations regularly. For example, his wife, Philippa of Hainault, was only crowned queen 2 years after their wedding, and this was probably only because she was 5 months pregnant and appearances had to be maintained. In the late summer of 1330, Edward was approaching his majority. Rumors spread that Isabella was pregnant by Mortimer and he could claim the throne. At a parliamentary session in October, the regent publicly insulted the king and deliberately walked in front of him so the court could clearly see it. According to the Scala Chronica, Edward was therefore advised by his friend William Montague that it was better to eat the dog than to be eaten by it. Together with a number of conspirators, the young men made plans for a coup which Parliament would later euphemistically call the King's Secret Plan. Rumors about this plan reached Mortimer and Isabella, both barricaded themselves in a castle. The king's mother took the keys personally. Mortimer summoned the conspirators to his council. Here everyone remained silent, apart from Montague, who denied the allegations. Mortimer let the group go, but they were afraid of how the regent would react afterwards. They therefore decided to take action immediately. A co-conspirator led the group into the fortress that night. They broke into Isabella's chamber. In a short fight, the guards were killed. Mortimer was taken into custody unharmed. According to the Brute Chronicle, Isabella knew her son was nearby but could not see him. She therefore ran through the corridors and is said to have begged for pity for Mortimer. In vain. Her lover was tortured and executed as a traitor. Edward himself then announced with this letter that he would henceforth rule in his own right. Due to the unexpected death of the Black Prince Edward, a minority re-emerged after the death of Edward III. The previous monarch himself ensured that Richard II would inherit the throne. There was a serious debate about this, as Richard was not his father's firstborn son, but only the eldest living son. In theory, therefore, John of Gaunt had just as good as a claim. He was, after all, the eldest living son of Edward III. This was one of the reasons for the above-mentioned distrust that Parliament showed the prince. The aforementioned council was established, but not for long. Parliament declared Richard's majority in 1380. It dismissed the council because it also distrusted it. Richard was only 13 years old and from then on officially operated in his own right. In fact, his uncle John of Gaunt unofficially took on a role that was very close to that of a regent. Extensive regulations were made in 1422 for Henry VI, who was only 9 months old. There were regents for the British Isles and for France. A Privy Council was also appointed. The end of the regencies was left open. The resolutions instead say that Henry's representatives should remain in office as long as it shall be pleasing to the king. Henry slipped into an independent government in the 1440s, but lost it to Richard of York in the 1450s, who was installed several times as Lord Protector and eventually even as heir to the throne. The Wars of the Roses had started. Edward V was the next king to inherit the throne while still being a minor. His father was only able to make arrangements on his deathbed, and we only know them secondhand. Accordingly, Richard of Gloucester should act as Lord Protector. However, the Privy Council overturned this decision and instead stipulated that Edward would immediately come of age. He should be given advice by a special council. However, Richard violently secured his appointment as Lord Protector and eventually even had himself crowned king. As mentioned, Henry VIII immediately ruled by himself in his own right. According to his father's will, his son Edward was initially supposed to be supported by a council until he could govern independently. In fact, as mentioned, Edward Seymour secured the office of Lord Protector. After his dismissal, the council remained in existence until Edward's death. As early as 1549, as part of the escalation with Somerset, the council wrote to the king that it was still loyal to him. Edward had written many letters before. His handwriting is distinctive and therefore easy to identify. However, it is unclear which letters he had to write and which one he actually wanted to write. After the end of Somerset as Lord Protector, we quickly find him acting autonomously. This was particularly true for the implementation of the Reformation. On July 5th, 1550, for example, he wrote to all bishops, together with his council, that the Reformation should be enforced. From 1551 there are various letters from him alone that are addressed to the English sheriffs and contain instructions. A letter from the King to the Lord Chancellor, dated October 1st, 1515, has been preserved, in which Edward inquired why proceedings were dragging on. He wrote that what the King specifies after consultation with his council had sufficient authority. A short time later, Edward wrote again to the Lord Chancellor about the commission that was to convict Somerset and others of treason. A memorandum from Edward on Acts of Parliament dated January 23rd, 1552 has also survived the centuries. Similar documents exist for special court cases that should be referred directly to the king. In 1552, Edward's sister Mary also wrote separately to the king and the council, which allows assumptions about what the minor monarch himself ordered and what came from the council. She explained to him that she was willing to move. She thanked the council for a financial reimbursement that the king had made. In the same year, Edward venerated the work of Basil the Great to Lady Jane Grey, saying that it could be more valuable to her than gold and precious stones. Edward also received a manuscript of his statutes for the Order of the Garter with a note from a lord, presumably William Cecil, that he was welcome to share his opinion on some parts with the monarch. As late as May 1553, Edward wrote to the bishops asking them to take note of the new articles of religion. Last but not least, we also find the king's handwritten regulations for his succession. This is the document in question. It's very interesting because we see how many changes have been made as Edward has had to respond to his deteriorating health. Edward's minority never officially ended either. However, the examples described underline how involved he was over time. We find similar references in the chronicles. For example, Edward himself had dinner alone with important dignitaries to discuss key issues. 2 points stand out based on the previous explanations. Firstly, regulations made by previous kings for minors did not last. Or, to put it in the words of Michael Hicks, kingly decisions inevitably died with their maker. Secondly, the end of the minority depended on the situation. In this regard, it is worth taking a closer look at the regulations and events, as not a single minority ended as planned. Wills and decrees of the deceased kings are the best sources for determining when, according to one's own perception, the successor's minority ended. However, there's another law that is interesting in this regard. It's from Henry VIII and dates back to 1536. The law states that a king may revoke laws passed by parliament during his minority as soon as he reaches the age of 24. In other words, his minority is now over at the latest. However, he set a different rule for his son Edward. The end of the 18th year of life should mark the beginning of his coming of age. As demonstrated, he was already heavily involved and made increasingly more decisions before that. Edward himself had a similar concept in mind in the first version of his presented device for the succession. It was not Lady Jane Grey who was supposed to rule, but rather her firstborn son as soon as he reached the age of 18. Until then, his mother would act as regent. Edward subsequently changed this when it became clear that he would die before Jane would have a child. With Edward III, a king forcibly ended his minority on his own initiative. In Henry III, there was a monarch who delayed this moment. In the case of Richard II, Parliament ended the minority prematurely. Henry VI was somehow slipping closer and closer to his majority. It is not clear at that moment Edward IV planned for his son to come of age. It seems plausible that turning 18 was also the idea in this case. However, as shown, the council wanted to change that, and Henry VIII no longer waited until this moment. What the observations from chapter 4 show is an idea that I have already touched on before. In theory, the English monarchy does not recognize any minority. To put it a little more simple, God chose a ruler but did not place any age restrictions. This wasn't just a disadvantage, it allowed a flexible reaction to the respective situation. The regulations for Henry VI were closest to reality on this issue, as they only tied the regent's office to the approval of the king and did not set a time limit. This gave the monarch the chance to grow into his office. Well, I give you that Henry VI did not make good use of it. We can also see how learning occurs from one minority to the next. After Richard II's problems without a regency, this tool was reintroduced to Henry VI, and Edward IV also wanted to keep it for his son. After the events of Richard and Edward V, Henry VIII decided against it. Nevertheless, Somerset was able to take this office because there was a power vacuum. It is also worth noting that there was actually only one minority in which king and regent did not clash, that one of Henry VI. These conflicts could result in violence and death. With the exception of Edward V, the king always had the better end for himself in the medium and long term. Overall, it seems wrong to think of the concept of the king's minority exclusively in terms of the categories of rights, functions, and privileges that would only accrue to him at a certain point in time. In theory, the monarch always had them. Even 9-month-old Henry VI, he effectively assumed power at his own discretion. If a minor king wanted to exert influence or make decisions, he could enforce this in the long term. The examples of Edward III and Edward VI show this most impressively. To return to the separation of office and office holder, minor incumbents grew into their office. This was the case at different points in time for each individual. It had to be clear that this very moment had arrived. When this was generally recognized, action was taken accordingly. It is therefore an extremely interesting counterfactual question whether Edward V could have saved himself. When his entourage was intercepted by his uncle, Richard was able to ignore Edward's objection to the arrest of his confidants. He had not yet grown into royal authority. However, Richard himself expected that this would have been the case with the coronation at the latest. Even a king who was not of age could not be disregarded forever.